Hello everyone and welcome to the EarthtonesGirl knitting series. My name is Denise and I'll be your host today. This knitting series is not going to be my typical podcast. This is the first of a series of knitting tutorials on various topics. The first 4 in the series are going to cover how to use 2 circular needles and how that applies to various garments that can be knit in the round. So I'm very excited to be bringing this to you today. This first episode is going to concentrate on how to apply 2 circular needles to socks. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is just 2 circular needles in general, and then you will see me knitting, demonstrating how to cast on, how to knit down the leg, turn the heel. I'm going to do a short row heel. Excuse me. I'm going to start with a short row heel. I will try to also include some video on a drop heel, which is more of a traditional heel, as well as knitting down the leg, knitting the toe, and then grafting the toe. I'm going to be knitting on a baby sock. For the sake of time, I was going to do a adult sock or even a footy, like a little short sock, but I think that would just take too long based on lifestyle and my lifestyle and how full my plate is, etc. But I think that you can still get all of the information that you need on, or rather watching me knit a baby sock. So I'm really excited. So let's start talking about 2 circular needles in general. Why would you want to knit on 2 circular needles? There are many options for knitting in the round. The most traditional and most commonly used are double pointed needles. I have tried those, they just didn't work for me. What this series is also going to provide is just tutorials and information that has worked for me over the years. I'm not going to try to sell you on this technique or any other technique. It's just, again, what has worked for me, and I have gotten a lot of requests from people about how to use 2 circular needles. So I thought by putting together this tutorial, I could answer everyone's questions and as many questions as I could all in one place. So let's go back. So 2 circular needles. I have several different kinds here that you can use, but why knit on them at all? Knitting on 2 circular needles just gives you another option. As I said a minute or two ago, you have double pointed needles, which is your standard, very traditional way of knitting a small circumference in the round. You also have magic loop. Magic loop is done also on a circular needle, but it has a very long cable. This particular cable, and the length of the circulars that I'm going to be using for these tutorials is 24 inches or 60 centimeters. Magic loop is usually done on a much longer needle. For a 40-inch, I believe, is sort of the standard, of 40-inch length cable, or you could even go as much as a 60-inch cable depending on how large your garment is, if you're knitting a very, very big sweater or a poncho or something really big. Again, I tend to use the 24-inch. I have tried knitting on a 12-inch, 2 12-inch circulars, and the length of the cable and the length of the actual needle itself was a little too short for me. I felt like I was working a little too tight, a little too close. The 24 inches just allows me a little more space. The length of the needle is very comfortable for my hands, and I have the room to put a good number of stitches or a few stitches on the needle. So here we have, now let's just talk needles for a moment. Actually, let's talk about the pros and the cons, because the biggest pro, I think, for knitting on circulars is, again, you can knit any size circumference you want, down to 4 stitches. If you want to knit 4, 2 on one needle, 2 on the other, you can knit a very tiny tube, or you can have as many as 400 stitches, 200 on one needle, 200 on the other. It's completely up to you. It just gives you another option that I find a little bit more comfortable. The primary thing for me is my garment is now in half. The same thing, you can do the same thing with magic loop, But again, the way that you pull the needles out to knit is just, it just doesn't work in my brain. And I've talked about that on my regular podcast. For me, the garment is now either in front to back that I'm knitting. So I knit across the front, I knit across the back, or I'm knitting in profile. For the most part, I tend to just turn the garment on the needle so that I'm knitting front to back. So if I'm knitting the sock, I knit across the front of the sock, I knit across the back, I knit across the front of the sock, I knit across the back. It's smooth, it's easy. I don't ever have to stop and think about it. I don't have to worry about how I'm pulling my needles out to knit, and I'll show you that once I actually get started. You'll see how I always am able to pick up the correct needle in order to knit. And I'm going to be using two different color needles, so it's easier for you to see that. But I'm also going to put it on two needles that are the same, and you'll see how that works as well. So the biggest con to knitting on two circular needles is that you have to buy two. You do have to buy two of every size that you need. And I know that that is very prohibitive for people. I said this word in my last podcast and couldn't say it then either, so I don't know what it is. It's not always cost effective. That's better. It's not always cost effective for people to buy two, and I understand that. There are some needles that are very expensive. When I first started knitting, I've always knit on two circulars. From the very, very first time I picked up needles, I've always worked on two circulars, and I started with Addi Turbos. These needles tend to be a little pricey. They can be anywhere from, I don't know, $13 to maybe $18, and the price depends on the size. Oh, there's actually a price tag on the back of this. This pair, this is a size 1, 2.5, I'm sorry, and this was $14.25 for one. So that's $30 pretty much to buy two circular needles, and I understand that that is very expensive, but there are alternatives to the Addi Turbos. You can buy Hiya Sharps. You can also buy ChiaoGoos. Now this is the way wrong size for socks. It's just, I happen to have two in this size, so I just wanted to show you what the packaging looked like. ChiaoGoos and Hiya Sharps are much less expensive. You can get these, actually, again, there's a price on the back. These only cost $9 per needle. So you can get a pair or two needles then for $18. That may still be a little bit high for people. That may fit into your price range. Another option, you can also use Susan Bates needles. I don't have any here with me, but you can purchase Susan Bates needles at Michael's or Joann's, and those excuse me, those needles are definitely less money as well. I think those range anywhere from $5 to maybe $6 or $7, so that might be a little bit better. The one thing with those needles though, that would be the second con to talk about, or the second negative in two circulars, is the stiffness of the cord. You want a cord that is as flexible as possible. The stiffer the cord, the more annoying it is to knit with. Now, I'm going to pull these Hiya Sharps out so you can see what I mean. Okay, you want your cable, when you're holding your needle, you want your cable to be super flexible, so that when you're actually knitting, the cable just hangs. I hope you can see it. I'm using a blue one because I thought it would be easier. The cable just hangs out of the way. Super easy, you're knitting along. And again, I tend to hold my needles with my whole hand. Some people will just use fingertips and they like to go, which some people will use a 9-inch circular needle. No, that's a whole other conversation. A whole other technique that we're not going to talk about here, but some people do like that, and they can go at a pretty good clip. You do want your cable needle to be very relaxed. Most, if not all of these, actually all of these needles, I find the cable to be user-friendly. It does hang out of your way. Sometimes with the older Addis, which is this packaging right here, with just the Addi Turbos, I find the cable can be a little bit stiff. But what I tend to do when I take it out is just kind of run it through my finger a little bit, and it hangs perfectly. You know what? I will actually demonstrate that on one of these. And I think it has, again, that's always worked for me. This is giving me a hard time to open. Just Just bear with me 1 second. Okay, I got it out of the packaging. So as you can see, it's been in the bag for quite some time. I don't tend to use the Addi Turbos much anymore because the points are a little duller. What I do use are the Addi Rockets. The points are much pointier and the cable is much more relaxed. But again, if I want to relax this cable, now if you bought the Susan Bates needles from the craft store, your cable might look like this. So again, I take it and I kind of pull it through my finger. You can also just dip it for a couple of seconds in really hot water, and that tends to relax the cable a little too. So there you go. Nice and relaxed. And all I did, I held it tightly in my thumb and just ran it a couple of times through my finger. And that was enough to just relax the cable. I can flip it around and I can start knitting. So there you go. That is how I handle a really tight cable. So that's basically it in terms of the pros and the cons of circular needles. Again, I find it very, very easy to get my mind around how, I'm just going to put it back in the bag, but I can't find it, how my brain works and how I'm able to understand how to knit. It's also very easy to convert a project that might be done flat. For example, if you're knitting a sweater, and we'll talk about that. So let me digress for just a moment. This is going to be a 4-part series to start. The first episode, this episode is going to cover the basics of circular needles and how that applies to socks. The second, and not necessarily in this order, the second is going to be, another one is going to be mittens. Then we're going to do hats and cowls, and then sweaters. So, again, I lost my train of thought, but that's okay. So, I was saying that's basically it for the pros and the cons. Again, I am able to get my head around the back and forth very, very easily. You only also, another positive to two circulars, you only have two intersections. You only have one side and then the other side. If you're knitting, which the same does apply to magic loop, but I find when, in my experience, basically this is what the magic loop looks like. So you've got the cable here and your needles, this is on one side, this is on the other, what you're knitting is in the middle. Sometimes I find that this end, because the cable wants to expand, it may stretch your stitches a little bit on that side. Doesn't seem to bother people. I have heard people complain about that. So many people use it, so I don't see that it's that huge of a problem, but it is for me, in my experience. So when you're using, so again, you're only going to get the two intersections with the magic loop here and here. Same applies to two circulars. You're going to knit across, there's one intersection, you're going to get to the other end, there's the other intersection. When you're using double pointed needles, you can have as many as 3 or 4 intersections, and in my experience I get ladders. I get gapping in those spaces, and the ladders mean that there's more spaces between the stitches at those intersections, and it will look like a ladder. A little pet peeve of mine, I don't like it. Again, two circulars, that's my first choice. So how I'm going to demonstrate this is I'm going to use, again, 2 needles, same size, but different cables so that you can see the difference, okay? I might actually, if I have 2 in the same size, you'll be able to see the difference, trust me. So let me pause for a moment and then we'll talk about socks. So another really big question that I've had is, how do you even start to knit socks? How do you start? Where do you begin? Do you use books? Do you use tutorials? What do you do? If you have a local yarn shop near you and you have access to it, easy access to it, I would probably start there. I would go there, I would get my needles, I would look at sock yarn, pick my sock yarn and see if there's a class that the local yarn shop offers that you may be able to take there. If that's not an option, then you have a variety of tutorials available for knitting socks in various configurations, whether that's 2 circular needles, top down, toe up, double points, magic loop. There are excuse me, a lot of options for you on YouTube for free. There you go. The beauty of YouTube, you can watch it over and over and over and over again. You don't have to worry about pestering a teacher. You don't have to worry about feeling uncomfortable because you need to see something again and you're concerned about asking. You don't have to worry about any of that. Another option that's really great, and I've used this option, is Craftsy. That is another really great option for you. It helps. It's the same principle. You've got this video, you have a structured class with various lessons in the class, and you can watch them as many times as you want. The other beauty with Craftsy is you can actually interact with other students as well as your teacher. You can post questions. You have she will interact with you. There's class materials. It's a different, more interactive platform. I love Craftsy and I highly recommend that. And then you also have podcasters such as myself and various people back to YouTube that will put videos up and to help their viewers, to help viewers of their podcast, or just to put information out, which is what I'm doing with this. I have a passion for this. I'm very excited about it, and I just want to share as much information with you as I can. So again, now a big question is, or question number one, how do I pick my yarn? So let me grab a skein from up here. Okay, here I am. I just grabbed the first one. This is Mrs. Babs. This is her Joan of Arc colorway. Isn't that gorgeous? And I also have, where did I put the other? Bear with me one more second. Okay. I also have this yarn, which is Patton's Croy. This is a variegated, and they have many, many colors. I actually bought these to knit a pair of socks for someone a long time ago, and it didn't happen. But this is a self-striping. This is their semi-solid or tonal. Oops, that's upside down. I'm sorry. This is their tonal. This is a heathered brown color, which I've used for mittens. So you've got these two as an option. This is a lower cost option. You can get Patton's Croy at many craft stores. I know Michael's carries it, which is where I purchase it. Joann's does not. Does Joann's? I don't think they do. Or maybe they do. I've never bought it there. I've always bought it at Michael's. You have Hobby Lobby, I know, carries it. But it's a less expensive option, and you have coupons that you can use. These skeins cost about $4 or $5 for one. It is amazing yarn. It's workhorse yarn. It's real. It's 75% washable, superwash wool, 25% nylon. I have made socks out of these, and they last forever. You can walk barefoot in these and never get a hole. They are, and it's soft. It's soft. It feels, it's hardy. It's great, great yarn. Again, it's just a less expensive option because Patton's Croy is a larger company, so it is more mass produced. So if cost is a problem or an issue for you or a concern, and I absolutely understand that, this is a good alternative. And again, the colors are really beautiful. Now, if you want to try the indie dyed yarns, for example, there's many. I've got, as you can see, there's so many up there. It's a lot of options. Indie dyed yarn is a little more expensive because it is independently dyed by people in their homes, in small studios, in their kitchens, in their basements. So in order to cover their costs, the prices may be a little bit more. Do you get more variety? Do you get more richness of color? The yarn itself feels a little different. You have more options with blends. You get 75-25, which is 75% superwash wool versus nylon. And those numbers are the relationship between there's another word I want to use, and it's escaping me, but it's the percentage, thank you, between the wool content and the nylon content. The more wool content you have, I find the plumper and squishier the yarn. So if you have an 80-20, 80% wool, 20% nylon, I find the wool's a little bit squishier. Let me see what the percentage is on this, because this feels really good. This is an 80-20. And then you have a yarn that, like for example this one, or no, I don't know which one's off the top of my head, but you'll get a 75-25 and that feels a little thinner. Again, nothing wrong with it. I find those percentages and the types of yarn become personal preference. I like socks in both. I do prefer an 80-20 a little bit more. I like that squish factor a little more. I also find it flows off my needles a little bit better. I say experiment. If you have the option, now independently dyed yarn can be a little more expensive. This can be anywhere from $25 to $35 a skein. But you can get an entire pair of socks. So basically, let's just pretend for a minute that these are the same color. So you're talking, you know, $10 to $12 for a pair versus maybe $30 to $35 for a pair of socks. It depends on what can fit into your budget. But that is the basics on independently dyed yarn. I highly recommend going on Etsy. Just go on Etsy, enter self-striping yarn or sock yarn, and be prepared for the barrage, the plethora of knitting options, sock options that will present themselves. You can also do that hashtag on Instagram. You will get a lot of different options there, a lot of independently dyed companies from there. It's sky's the limit with your yarn, but that's how I would go about picking yarn. You have solids, tonals, speckled, semi-solid, you have self-striping, heathered, tweeded yarn. Again, they're all options. I recommend Googling those, going on Etsy, going on Instagram, even Ravelry. Go on Ravelry and just punch in sock yarn, and see what's out there, see what catches your eye. That is something that's a very individual choice. I can't say to you, use this over this. It's a very personal choice, but that at least gives you some idea of where to begin. And again, in terms of needles and picking your needles, that is also a personal choice. 2 circulars is just a technique, but which 2 circulars to use, again, it's personal choice. I started with the Addi Turbos. They were the tips of the needles are more rounded. It's a slightly blunter needle. I thought those were great. I also knit socks on a US 2, which is huge. I mean, I think a US 2 is a 3mm needle. That's what I started knitting my socks on. It was a very holy, as in not a very tightly woven sock. And I actually found it uncomfortable under my feet because you could really feel the stitches and it became uncomfortable. The smaller your needle, the tighter the weave and the fabric of your sock, the longer it wears. It wears better when it's more tightly knit, when it's a denser fabric. So I moved from a size 2 to a 1, which is 2.5mm needles, and then found myself just in the last maybe year or so, year and a half, everybody kept talking about 2.25. That it was an in-between size. I couldn't find it. I finally decided to go online. I found them on Amazon. I tried Hiya Sharps 2.25. That is now my needle of choice. I love the fabric that it produces. I love the sock. It is comfortable. It fits perfectly for me. But again, it was trial and error. I have used Addi lace needles. I tried those to basically get a pointier tip, and there was also more drag on the needle. If you're worried about using metal needles and you want a little bit more friction, you want the stitches to move a little slower on the needle, then the Addi lace needles, Addi Turbo lace needles are a good option. Again, they have, however they've treated the needle itself, there is a little bit more drag on the needle, so the stitches don't just slip, which can make people a little nervous. So this is another option. You have a great tip on these. You have a good cable. The cable is very relaxed. If it's not, again, I've explained how to remedy that. And it's just another option for you. So there's Addi Turbos, Addi Rockets, Hiya Sharps, ChiaoGoos. You have ChiaoGoos here. Again, another option, a less expensive option. These were $10.50 for each, and I bought these at Knitty City, which is a yarn shop in Manhattan in New York. And again, it's just another option for you. It is another very good tip and another great cable. So there's a lot of, and then there's also the Susan Bates needles, which are, I think, the least expensive on the tier, that you can purchase more at a craft shop. So we've covered needles, I've covered yarn, I've covered options for classes. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. You know, as I'm talking, I've made some notes, but if there's anything that I haven't said here that you would like to see, please feel free to leave me a message. You can send me an email, send a message, and all of the information I'm talking about here will be in the description box down below. I'm not going to do any of the little subtitles that I usually do. This video is just more for get the information out to you. You can reference everything down below. There'll be links to everything if you need to see them. And there you go. So now I think we should start knitting. I did want to say one more thing about sock yarn. Again, I do understand that sock yarn can be expensive. But again, there's a lot of swapping options on Ravelry. I do suggest going on Ravelry and see what's available. Sometimes people will discount. They've purchased a lot of yarn in bulk. They will discount a lot of it. Look at that as options. You can get your hands on a lot of the indie dyed yarn, a lot of the more aesthetically pleasing yarns, if you want to call it that. And I don't ever want to come across as having some bottomless pit of money and I can just buy all of this stuff, because that is definitely not the case. Definitely not. My husband would be standing at the door like, if he, God forbid, actually ever saw my entire stash. But go and see what options there are out there. I'm not also trying to take anything away from purchasing directly from the dyers. But again, I do understand if money is a concern for people or finances are a concern for people, but you still want to knit things. This may sound really funny, but I'm not a big shopper. I don't buy a lot of clothes. Our children are very, very young, so we don't really have our house, beautifully decorated, because there's going to be handprints of finger paint and everything on the walls and on the couch and everything else. And not that our kids run amok, but you know what I mean. Having young children in a home can be a little bit messy sometimes. So right now, a lot of my purchasing and a lot of my, I guess, allowance, if you want to call it that. Not that my husband gives me an allowance, but if there is extra money from whatever occasion, I will then use that or save up to buy what might be considered the good stuff. And you're going to spend the same amount of time knitting with the less expensive yarn that you do with the really expensive yarn, and there really is a difference. Sue Stokes, who is Legacy Fiber Arts, and she's an incredible indie dyer, she said one day, oh dear, I had this great quote from her, I can't think of it now, but it's supporting what I said with, it really is, oh, that's it. It's all about your tools. It's the tools that you're using. The better the tools, the better the experience, the better the final product. And she's absolutely, absolutely right. I, way back in the day, didn't really ever wear the socks that I made, and now I wear them now. And knitting friends that have known me for years, they are surprised. They'll get a peek when my pant leg goes up a little bit and they're like, whoa, she's wearing her socks, because the yarn is so beautiful. It's beautifully dyed. It's better quality yarn. It really does make for a better experience. So if it is within your means, try the indie stuff, look on Ravelry, look around, barter with people. Bartering is another option. I have bartered on many occasions for yarn. Where there's a will, there is a way. So just think it through, be creative, and see what comes your way. So again, I said before, let's get to knitting, but now we really are. Let's go.